Good morning. Welcome to the 2020 conference, ASFPM conference. Today, you're in the first session. It's learning from the most recent flood events in the US. Our first speakers today are Eryn Futral. She is with, sorry, I lost my slide. Here we go. With the North Carolina Eastern. She's the North Carolina Eastern NFIP planner with the North Carolina Emergency Management Agency.
Good morning, folks. My name is Eryn Futral, and I am the Eastern Branch Planner for the North Carolina National Flood Insurance Program. I have been working in floodplain management for just over 11 years, and my first experience with actually performing damage assessment came with Hurricane Florence in 2018. When Hurricane Dorian hit the following year, I had been with the state for about 6 months, and I was called to work the night shift with the North Carolina Emergency Management Eastern Branch Ops Center. So shortly after Dorian passed through, I was called to assist with the damage assessments for Ocracoke. During this presentation, I will discuss logistics and access, data needs and the limited availability of data once we were on the island, the fact that there was a significant number of historic structures on Ocracoke, and that new flood maps will be becoming effective in June, and we'll see how that plays into the rebuilding efforts. Ocracoke Island has a pretty interesting history, and it intertwines with the infamous pirate Blackbeard. He loved the islands, and it became one of his preferred homes, in addition to Ocracoke Inlet, which was one of his favorite plundering destinations before he was killed in 1718. So the village itself has had a long history, surviving hundreds of years as an unincorporated village located in Hyde County. It has a year-round population of approximately 560 residents. And the median ground elevation is 2 to 3 feet NABD, making it vulnerable to flood. But interestingly enough, Ocracoke hasn't had too many floods since it's protected from the ocean surge on the ocean side. Hurricane Dorian was the most powerful storm in the Atlantic Ocean, causing devastation along its path as a Category 5. When Dorian made landfall at Cape Hatteras on September 6th, it had downgraded to a Category 1. But as we learned from Hurricane Florence, you cannot let the category fool you. The storm surge on the sound side of the Outer Banks was over 7 feet. And all the water and the surge from the Pamlico Sound was forced back down to Ocracoke Island. As you can see from the Feynman snapshot here, the storm surge reached 7.3 feet. And the inundation lasted only a few hours, but it affected many structures, and a lot of those were contributing historic structures. You can see kind of in the background here the highlighted building footprints, and the ones that are in purple and red were flooded with up to 5 feet of water. And currently our flood insurance maps provide a BFE of 6 feet, and the preliminary maps, which go effective June 19th, 2020, provide BFEs of 3 to 5 feet. So this is a great example of where a community has a known flood elevation and should regulate development to or above that known flood elevation, which was 7.3 feet here. So logistics, it was important at this point to determine what exactly we needed to know and what questions to ask in order to pull this thing off. So things like, what exactly did the village of Ocracoke and Hyde County employees need assistance with? And how are we going to gain access to the island, and where were we going to stay? Who would create the master list of structures for damage assessment? And how many of those structures were designated historic? And then how many volunteers would we need to do this work? Dorian struck on September 6th, and by September 11th, the North Carolina National Flood Insurance Coordinator, was in Swan Porter meeting in person with the Hyde County Building Inspector and via phone with the county manager and a county commissioner. This was a logistical meeting to determine how to do the damage assessments to maintain consistency in those determinations. So at this time, they really discouraged our team from seeking accommodations on the island. And this was in order to save available housing for displaced homeowners and emergency responders. They were also unsure of who controlled access to the island, which made it more challenging for us to secure reservations on the ferry to and from the island each day. So here is a part of our jolly and amply caffeinated crew. We had 3 staff members from the NFIP, 2 building inspectors from Hyde County, and 3 volunteers. The volunteers were 2 staff members from the Town of Beaufort Planning Department and 1 engineer from Professional Engineers of North Carolina, or PENC. It's interesting, PENC has had a long-standing relationship with the state for assisting with damage assessments. So a big thank you goes out to our volunteers. So access, as I said earlier, we were unsure of who controlled access to the island, and we really never found out who that was. We just ended up calling everyone to let them know we were coming. We called Hyde County Planning, Hyde County Emergency Management, North Carolina Emergency Management, North Carolina Department of Transportation, and we even called our Emergency Management Eastern Branch Manager in Kinston. So there are normally 2 ferry terminals serving Ocracoke, but the northern terminal was not running since the road between the terminal and the village was wiped out. Also, prior to our travels, we were warned to have our credentials ready because they were receiving messages from emergency management personnel that people were trying to impersonate FEMA Region 4 representatives and even insurance claims adjusters. So that was interesting. And we were told and knew that we did not want to hinder the county or emergency management response for recovery and rebuild. So lodging was obviously limited, so it was important that any available lodging was reserved for residents first, and then emergency responders and non-governmental organizations. And those, a couple of those were Samaritan's Purse and Baptist Men. Substantial damage assessments were our priority, but not anyone else's priority, so we were not to get in the way of the recovery efforts. And to help us out, the Town of Beaufort Planning staff secured lodging for us in Beaufort at the North Carolina per diem rate. Into that hotel, the ferry ride to and from the island was a 2.5-hour ride, and the hotel was another 45-minute drive from the ferry terminal. At this point, the event was not federally declared disaster, so there was no public or individual assistance available to the property owners. And it was the end of the fiscal year for FEMA, so their travel budget was restricted. So even though they did offer assistance to help us with our assessments, the lack of internet connectivity on the ferry and cell service prevented us from effectively incorporating their assistance. So the Thursday and Friday night before we headed to Beaufort, we frantically started putting everything together. And Dan likes to call this planning on the fly. All of our information needed to be compiled prior to getting to the island. And it was very important to get there as soon as possible because we knew that people would begin rebuilding and spending money on a structure that may be substantially damaged. So we worked on a preliminary list of structures, and we contacted the State Historic Preservation Office to begin identifying the historic structures. The list of structures was compiled from the Hyde County GIS. GIS is always your best friend. And structures built prior to 2006 were flagged as they would most likely not be compliant with current development standards. So, was the first floor elevation below BFD? They probably didn't have flood venting, and utilities may not have been elevated. The State Historic Preservation Office identified historic structures through cross-referencing our list prepared from the GIS with their own records. And so from this list, we were able to determine that 259 structures needed the preliminary damage assessments. And so that translated to 259 assessments conducted in 2.5 days by 6 of us on foot and 2 of us on bikes. So we talked about historic structures. It is important to note that the coordination with the State Historic Preservation Office was key and much appreciated. There were eventually 60 structures identified that were contributing, and only 3 or 4 structures were actually historic, and one of those was the Islands Lighthouse. The options for those structures would be to build back to pre-damage conditions through a variance, or just to mitigate to an extent that doesn't change the historic status, such as elevation. If a property owner chose to seek a variance, it was important to help them understand that the issuance of a variance would not affect their flood insurance premiums. So building back to pre-storm conditions would still have they would still have the same flood insurance premiums. Basic logistics. So we divided into 4 teams of 2 with 2 of us riding bikes. And that was very helpful in reaching the outer edges of the village. We also wanted to be as unobtrusive as possible and make sure that we were not holding up any recovery operations. So the rest of us were on foot. Hyde County Inspections provided an introductory letter to each of our teams, which explained to property owners our actions and gave us permission to be on their property. Each team was provided a clipboard with substantial damage estimator worksheets, an introductory letter, and a copy of the SDE percent damaged breakdown. We had 3 staff members from NFIP. So all information collected on the SDE worksheets was entered in the SDE 3.0 tool by NFIP staff on the 2.5-hour ferry ride back to the mainland. The weather was hot and humid, and the mosquitoes were out in full force, so it was necessary to wear loose-fitting, long-sleeve shirts, closed-toed, comfortable shoes, and to bring bug repellent, food, and water. So there are 3 SDE worksheets, one for residential structures, one for non-residential structures, and manufactured homes. This is the residential worksheet, and this includes general event and team information, structure location, structure components, their percent damage, quality of construction, and their depreciation rating. So our teams most often use the average condition depreciation rating unless the structure was clearly in very poor condition or new construction, and that helped with consistency. Any and all correspondence between NFIP staff and the county inspector was also sent or copied to the county commissioners and county manager. And that was no matter how mundane the material. We wanted to inform them and not to be accused of hiding any information. On the first morning of our assessments, the NFIP coordinator met with the county commissioner and county manager at the recovery center to debrief on our plan and talk about the options available to citizens, historic structures, the permitting process, and temporary occupancy. On a side note, FEMA does allow temporary occupancy of a substantially damaged structure, but there is a permitting process. And fact sheets about this allowance can be found on FEMA's website at FEMA.gov. Also, because of the sensitive nature of conducting damage assessments, each team set out making it a priority to speak with the property owners, answer any questions, and be completely honest about those assessments. The fire station served as the recovery center, and this is where residents could get necessary supplies such as food, water, cleaning supplies, and clothing. This building is elevated and was a good location for recovery to be housed. So the STE training form provided estimated percentages of damage based on elevation of floodwaters and the length of inundation. And this was key in providing consistent assessments among our teams. In addition, we traded partners each day to help provide difference in perspective and to keep with consistency. And there was a lot of damage, but foundation damage was prevalent due to the fact that many of the homes were built on piers with cross-facing closures, which lacked flood venting or wave action on the sound side to damage some pile foundations. The Hyde County GIS had not been updated in about 2 years, so what we may have seen on the ground at a particular site may not have been what was represented in the tax parcel data. So structures were different and tax values may not have been clearly representative of what was there. We did need to make assumptions, so it was necessary for us to assume for the assessments especially, we were basing building value on the tax assessed value, and we found the tax values were not all accurate due to the length of time since the information had been updated. So we also used the unit replacement cost with depreciation. So both assessments, tax value and the replacement cost, were provided to Hyde County for each structure. Unit cost and replacement cost, those were based on tax assessments from the last 5 years. This allowed us to have an apples to apples approach, so they would be consistent. And then we also used assumptions while performing the assessments. So we assumed based assumptions on percent damaged, and that was kind of using rack line or high water marks, as well as using what was piled up at the edge of the road. So you can see that there was a whole bunch of debris. There may be appliances, furniture, flooring, air handlers, things like that. So we would assume the percent damage based on what we saw there. Damage was not linear, meaning the percent damage did not follow a smooth curve. So if water was below the HVAC system, then the percent of damage was relatively low. But if the water got above the HVAC unit or system, then the percent of damage jumped very quickly to 75% or above for damage. The same also applies with electrical systems. Once it gets above your meters and above your outlets, that percent damage jumps very high quickly. Also, once water levels got above the flooring, it had to be replaced. So that equals 100% damage. Foundations, it's harder to determine and takes a closer eye or even a more trained eye, but it is generally really hard to not call foundation damage substantial. So here you can see the hydrostatic pressure damaged the foundation due to the lack of flood venting. The foundation appears to have slightly shifted also. Interestingly, the deep pile foundations did not do as well as the shallow pier foundations, and we're not really sure why this was the case. But on this structure, you can see that the front piles settled and the foundation moved towards the front of the structure. You can notice it even more if you look at the HVAC platform. The structure appears to lean towards the left. Again, you must have a keen eye to see some of the damages. The structure on the left is located right on the sound, so the bracing was damaged probably due to the wave action, but the deck appears to be completely destroyed. So just strange damage that we saw. The structure on the right has a shallow foundation, seems to be intact, doesn't seem to have damage to the actual house itself, but the deck floated and seems to have shifted. And this is just an interesting photo. It seems to be a travel trailer with a structure built around it and above it. A survey crew from North Carolina Geodetic Survey was sent out to the island shortly after the event to record the high water marks, which confirmed the data that we got from Lyman on the 7.3 foot of surge. NCGS is part of risk management, and we both benefited from our close coordination. And you can see in this photo rack lines or the high water marks. As I mentioned, we took the time on the ferry ride to enter all the data collected each day into the SDE tool. Data entry got off to a slow start that first day because I, for one, had never had to use the SDE tool, and the others who were using it probably hadn't used it within a year or so. So we also had to get all of our generic data inputted correctly and make sure we entered the same information for consistency in those SDE determinations. So NFIP staff worked on entering data while the other team members took the time to plan for the next day, like reassign our teams and to begin pre-populating those SDE worksheets based on the GIS data. The ferry rides themselves were pretty interesting, to say the least. Both days, the wind was just whipping. But on the second day, the wind was so bad that the authorities were considering not running that last ferry back to Cedar Point. So we would have been stranded on the island. But thankfully, the wind steadied and we were able to get back to the hotel for the night. So things that were on the ground were not what we expected. So earlier I mentioned there was a lapse in updating the tax data. So at times we were looking for a structure that just wasn't there. The structure here in this picture was to be at grade, but as you can see, it is elevated in new construction. We also ran into situations where there was more than one structure on the property, so we had to develop a labeling system to identify each one of those structures for that address. Once the assessments were finished, we compiled all of our data and provided a final list of substantially damaged structures to Hyde County. We also needed to consider the preliminary maps, which lowered the BFE from 6 feet to anywhere from 3 to 5 feet, which was well below the recent flood level of 7.3 feet. And so we had to consider how this would affect the rebuilding efforts. We identified 110 structures out of 259 that were potentially substantially damaged. So we provided 2 determinations for each structure, one based on the tax assessed value and one on the actual cash value with depreciation. We noted in our final list the preliminary BFE data and whether a structure was historic. Noting that the structure was historic on the list would assist Hyde County staff in determining whether a variance would be possible. We also discussed with Hyde County representatives the ramifications of adopting the preliminary BFEs prior to the effective date of June 19, 2020, which could potentially remove flood damaged structures from the SDE list. Templates were provided to Hyde County staff, which included letters to property owners for substantially damaged structures and non-substantially damaged structures. And included in those letters to property owners was information on the permitting process, State Historic Preservation Office, AICP funding, certified floodplain surveyors, data on the effective and preliminary flood maps, and contact information for the recovery offices. So options for historic structures. Property owners of historic structures could consider moving forward if they were going to be eligible to apply for a variance from floodplain development standards. And they needed to consider if they were going to do that they would not receive any breaks from flood insurance, and that could become a financial burden. They could also and should work with the State Historic Preservation Office when deciding how to construct or repair. So whatever they decided, they would need to know if what they're proposing would or would not maintain the structure's historic status. The preliminary maps, as I said, are going to become effective June 19th, 2020, but the county commissioners have the option of adopting those maps earlier. As noted earlier, we identified the preliminary BFEs for each structure. And for some structures, the first floor elevation was above that preliminary BFE. So this could potentially remove the structure from the SD list, depending on when the county chose to adopt the new maps and when an insurance claim was filed. So once the new BFE is adopted and made effective, a compliant structure would not be able to file an ICC claim. We wanted to make sure the commissioners, staff, and citizens were aware of all options and ramifications. Hyde County is currently considering adopting higher standards for construction. I believe staff is recommending a 7.5-foot elevation standard for commercial structures and a 9-foot elevation standard for residential structures. And the lower standard for commercial structures was based on the ADA requirements and kind of the issues of having that higher first finished floor. So Ocracoke is well on the way to recovery, but it's been slow moving due to logistical issues with getting materials and debris on and off the island. For an example, there were hundreds of cars flooded and housed at the airport after the storm. So when do you begin removing the cars? Because immediately after the storm, the ferries were packed with emergency response personnel and vehicles, residents, supplies, and construction materials. The debris removal timeline was extended to February 29th, which is almost 6 months later. And the rebuilding efforts will continue well into 2021. But the islanders are overwhelmingly determined to recover and build back higher and safer. They want to be able to, again, welcome visitors to their islands, let them enjoy the beautiful area called Ocracoke. And based on what we've seen since Dorian, they have a definite understanding of the need to accommodate the forces of nature. So with that, that completes my presentation, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Hello, everyone. So that was our first presentation. I have Eryn here. Do we have you, Eryn?
I'm here. Thank you.
All right. We got 2 questions in today. The first one is, can you elaborate about how you got access to individual buildings and if there was any issues?
We, most of the homeowners were present when we were there. They were all still in cleanup mode. And if we were, if there was nobody there, the houses were wide open. So we still had those letters of access from Hyde County. And so when we spoke to people, we were welcomed. They were so very nice. We really only encountered one homeowner that really questioned what we were doing and why we were there. So it was a pretty good experience, even though it was a really bad time.
Very good. And then the other question came from somebody that missed part of the presentation, and they asked, did the state work with local officials on the fieldwork and the substantial damage determinations and compliance?
Yeah, definitely. So there was a meeting prior to us even going out to Ocracoke Island, and our NFIP coordinator at the time, Dan Brubaker, worked with the county commissioners and the county manager on how to best utilize their tax info to help with those damage assessments and values of those buildings. And then we did work with 2 of the Hyde County building inspectors during those inspections, which kind of help train them for future events.
And then another question, why lower BFEs? I'm not sure what they're referring to.
So the preliminary maps, the studies that were performed as far as to create those new maps. All the data that went in there showed that those BFEs should be lowered. And then, of course, we have this event that shows that flooding can reach to 7.3 feet. And so that's why it was really important for us to communicate to individual communities that if you have a known flood elevation and your BFEs, for whatever reasons, are going down, you should really make an effort to regulate to those known flood elevations to help the safety of your citizens.
And did you help on follow-ups if SDEs were being appealed by the building owner?
We have been working with or trying to communicate with the Hyde County Building Inspections Department. So far, they have said that there's been no issues with either elevating or trying to reconstruct to higher standards, which is excellent. Excellent. I think everybody there knew the seriousness of the situation.
That's impressive. I'm
Absolutely.
from Nebraska and coming from all the appeals we've had. That's pretty cool. Another question, did you use any rules of thumb for estimating damages, like 3 feet of flood depth was about equivalent to 50% damage or anything like that?
Absolutely. FEMA provides a training guide that's actually several sheets long, and it's for residential, non-residential structures, and it provides the level of inundation, so that the amount of feet that the water is into the structure above the first floor, and it provides the length of inundation. So it gives you really good percentages of, hey, if it's 4 feet above first floor and it's been inundated for at least 5 hours, you can consider the percent of damage to be this. So it kind of gave you a baseline to go by. Super helpful.
Very cool. And then how were the SDE determinations issued? Was it by letter? Was it when they came in for permits?
So what we did is we inputted all that information that we took each day into the SDE 3.0 tool, and we provided the spreadsheet from that information to Hyde County. And so they could use the SDE tool to create those letters and issue those letters. And there were substantial damage letters, and then there were non-substantial letters. So you would give it to both, so they would know where they stood.
Perfect. And let's see, here's another person that says it came in late, but were you able to use mutual aid assistance from other local or neighboring state officials with your damage assessments?
So we used one engineer volunteered from the Professional Engineers of North Carolina. We do have kind of an ongoing relationship with them. We also used 2 officials from Beaufort County from the planning department. They volunteered to go out there as well. So we did have some additional support, and there was 3 state staff members.
Very good.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite success story from the project?
I think that the people on the island and how pleasant they were working with them, that is a huge success story. Those are very hard conversations to have, but I also think that the willingness for these folks to elevate and understand the impact of that storm, I think that's a huge success as well.
Very good. Well, thank you, Eryn. I enjoyed your presentation. I'm sure everyone else listening did as well. Next up, did you have anything else you wanted to share before I move on, Eryn? I'm sorry.
No, thank you, everybody. And sorry, there's no video.
All right, so our next presentation is from Jamie Reinke from the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. She'll be presenting the 2019 Nebraska Flood Overview and the importance of post-event data collection. So we'll start this now.
Thank you all for joining me today. My name is Jamie Reinke. I am an engineer in the floodplain management section of the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. As some of you may know, 2019 was a challenging year for the state of Nebraska. We saw persistent and widespread flooding across much of the state. We had gauge locations in flood stage from March through December and saw many rivers and streams carrying double their normal flows even into this spring. Today, I'm going to share a story map that was created by our office detailing specifically the events leading up to the March 2019 flood, which was the start of a devastating year of flooding for our state. Due to time constraints, I won't be showing all interactive pieces of the story map, but you are welcome to access it on our website, dnr.nebraska.gov, at your convenience. So getting into the story map, we'll set the stage for the events leading up to March 2019. We had record snowfall accumulation across Nebraska between January and March, and seasonal snowfall had exceeded 50 inches in some locations in Nebraska, with as much as 16 inches of snow remaining on the ground in parts of the state leading up to March 12th. February in particular brought far more snow than average. Lincoln recorded over 23 inches in February, its most since 1965, and Lincoln generally averages around 5.5 inches for February in snowfall accumulation. The National Weather Service in Valley, just outside of Omaha, recorded 27 inches of snowfall in Omaha in February, which they normally average around 6 inches. Major river systems in Nebraska remain covered by ice and snow. The satellite imagery on the right shows ground conditions at the confluence of the Platte and Elkhorn rivers near Valley on March 4th, 2019 versus early March of 2018. So you can see there's a significant amount of snowpack on the ground. In addition to the heavy snowfall, February 2019 was also among the 10 coldest Februaries on record for many locations. February set the stage as snow and below freezing temperatures were persistent across the area. Several official weather stations recorded either their second or third coldest period on record between February 15th and March 15th, and the coldest since at least the early 60s. The far below average temperatures for February and March led to a deep frost depth. The National Weather Service in Valley, again just outside of Omaha, measured a frost depth of 17 inches on March 11th. And the National Weather Service in Hastings, which is in south central Nebraska, observed a March 11th frost depth of 25 inches. This cool trend continued into March as daily temperatures would not rise above climatic normal until March 12th. And then we saw rapid changes in temperature, causing that ice and snow to thaw at accelerated rates. Lincoln recorded a high temperature of just 8 degrees Fahrenheit on March 3rd, which is 38 degrees below normal. By March 13th, the high temperature rose to 63 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 12 degrees above normal. Winter Storm Ulmer, which is the name of the system that caused such devastation, was named on the afternoon of March 11th. To meet that winter storm criterion, 400,000 square kilometers had to be under winter storm warnings, and that would be met the following day. On March 12th, Governor Ricketts issued an emergency declaration for Nebraska to prepare for potential historic flooding. He coordinated with the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency in that effort, trying to get everyone prepared for what was to come. On March 13th, the Nebraska Department of Transportation issued an immediate press release preparing for the impending winter storm. So the western part of the state was expecting to see blizzard-like conditions, heavy snow, high winds, but the eastern part of the state was preparing for rainfall with this event, knowing that we had a deep frost depth and we had a lot of snowpack, water equivalent still on the ground. We were sure that we were going to see some amount of flooding. But the blizzard warnings were issued for much of the region as heavy snowfall and high winds were reported. In fact, on March 13th, wind gusts of over 100 miles per hour were recorded in several locations. High winds associated with this very low pressure system were recorded from western Nebraska all the way to southern New Mexico. So just a huge storm moving into the area. Ulmer was a 970 millibar bomb cyclone that moved out of the central Rockies on March 12th. It was defined as a bomb cyclone if it met the criteria that it had a 24 millibar drop in atmospheric pressure in 24 hours or less. Ulmer dropped 24 millibars in only 13 hours. The storm reached a record low pressure of 968 millibars on March 13th, dropping 26 millibars in only 16 hours. Through March 13th and 14th, the system continued to move across the state of Nebraska, bringing wind, rain, and heavy snow to much of the area. It was a very intense storm. Heavy snowfall, high winds, and flooding made traveling nearly impossible across much of the state. DOT encouraged travelers to use their Plow Tracker app to see conditions on the ground. So this is an interactive map. Right now it doesn't look too impressive because it's live and it's not winter. But you can imagine this was lit up with plows everywhere. And if you would click on a plow, it would show an image of what the road conditions look like from the view of the plow. The Nebraska 511 traveler information page from March 13th showed the image on the left. You could see we had a lot of closures out west. That was due to that blizzard-like conditions. And then in the eastern part, we had some closures due to icy roads and snowfall, but a lot of this was due to flooding, bridges being washed out, water over roads. You can see there's a line here. The pink indicates where we had icy, snowy road conditions, anything west of this line. But this line kind of in the middle of the state really is that break from where everything was closed due primarily to the blizzard conditions versus that was closed due to the flooding conditions. So Interstate 80, if you follow my cursor, is this main travel corridor through Nebraska. It was shut down for around 20 hours during the blizzard, and troopers with the State Patrol were out helping drivers from sunup to sundown. The State Patrol performed more than 320 motorist assists, responded to 30 crashes, and assisted outside agencies with 25 other incidents. In fact, they stationed troopers at different exits along I-80 to keep people from getting onto the road to allow DOT crews to plow snow. And they really had to be careful in how they were closing down the interstate too. They, of course, in the western part had to close down due to road conditions and visibility issues, but they also were having to close exits as exits were filling up. We had truckers that were getting off the roads, we had travelers that were getting stranded, and hotels ran out of space. So there was a combination of issues on the interstate that were going on. However, by March 14th, many of the roads in the eastern part of Nebraska were closed due to flooding or because they were gone. This is Highway 281 just outside of Spencer, Nebraska, and this was washed away. This bridge was washed away after the Spencer Dam breached. Widespread rainfall of up to 3 inches, along with that rapid snowmelt, sent local creeks and rivers to record levels in a matter of hours as the rainfall couldn't infiltrate because the ground was frozen, as I talked about earlier. And 3 inches of rainfall is not an abnormal amount of rain for Nebraska. You know, it'd be a big rainfall, but it's not something that would cause this level of devastation on its own. We see 3 inches of rain in the summer and spring regularly. Damaged roadways, flooded roadways. There were people who took their chances, as you can see, and likely regretted their decisions thereafter. But many highways and bridges across the area were damaged, and motorists trying to get around, trying to get home or to work, were met with treacherous traveling conditions. The damage to bridges was extensive, and while many of them are open now, there are still some locations that are undergoing their permanent repairs still, some of those bigger bridges. Flooded highways left many communities isolated as their entrances and exit roads to and from town were flooded. This is the city of Elkhorn, just outside of Omaha. And you can see there's no way in or out because the road is flooded. We had levied communities that were completely surrounded by floodwaters. And I just can't imagine how terrifying that had to have been for residents of those communities. We had dozens of communities that underwent partial or full evacuations. There were entire communities that were inundated with floodwaters as levees breached or as these streams rose. This image is of Valley, and Valley actually flooded due to a levee breach that occurred upstream. The Weather Service has an office in Valley, and their office didn't flood. They were 6 inches from getting water in their building, but they were surrounded by floodwater and they were forced to evacuate their facility. And they actually jointly handled operations out of the Hastings office. So Omaha and Hastings were both operating out of Hastings in south central Nebraska, just to make things more difficult. This is the list of evacuations as of March 15th. You can see that it's a pretty decent list of communities that were undergoing partial or full evacuations, but this map is more telling. It shows how widespread those communities were. So we weren't just looking at pockets in the eastern part of the state. This was stretching out all the way to the center of the state, which is hundreds of square miles worth of land that was being evacuated or impacted. Urban Search and Rescue Task Force 1, the Nebraska National Guard, and the State Patrol worked together to provide water and air rescue missions. More than 300 Guard members responded in helicopters, Humvees, and other trucks with high ground clearance. If you get into the story map, you can see this video of a helicopter evacuation. The National Guard worked with state and local officials to conduct search and rescue operations, distribute food and water, and transport first responders to affected areas. So trying to get the people to where they needed to be to help, or trying to get people out of their homes if they were surrounded by floodwaters. The State Patrol worked around the clock assisting in rescue efforts, delivering essential supplies and reporting emergency road conditions to key decision makers. So trying to help people make decisions on where people could be traveling or who should be traveling, where it was safe to travel. Local volunteers and emergency personnel also answered this call. This image on the left shows rescue crews carrying the last evacuees from near Ashland out by airboat. These large sheets of ice and sediment destroyed roads, levees, bridges, everything downstream that came in its path. Ice on the Niobrara River measured 18 to 24 inches thick before the storm. Some ice chunks were estimated to have weighed as much as 3 tons. So you can imagine what that looks like when it comes in contact with anything. So this is another bridge that's downstream of Spencer Dam that was washed away. This is not the highway bridge. This is a different one. We have pictures of steel girder bridges that the steel girders have huge dents in them from the ice chunks that hit. It just caused massive devastation. And as these local bridges washed away, the critical emergency routes were compromised. Highway 281, which was just downstream of Spencer Dam, was the main link between O'Neill and Spencer, and they didn't really have a great way to get around that area, and that was not uncommon. We had many communities that were just isolated due to the road closures. This was Highway 12 just outside of Niobrara, and this bridge, actually the deck lifted up in floodwaters and traveled a couple hundred yards downstream and was deposited on a sandbar. This video actually shows that bridge floating away. Highway 14, south of Fullerton and more central Nebraska. And this is what DOT was tasked with. This is what was left as the waters receded, these large chunks of ice and debris on roadways that they had to figure out a way how to clear the roads that weren't gone so that people could have some sort of a transportation system to get around. Spencer Dam on the Niobrara River was breached by ice and record stream flows. Those large blocks of ice floated downstream and took out pretty much anything in its path. You can see this again is 281, a different view of this, Highway 281. This is what was left on the roadway, and then the bridge you can barely see, but the bridge is gone in the background. And this was the cafe in Niobrara, and it was filled up with ice chunks and water. And you can see the devastation that was caused by the ice as it traveled downstream. If you want to get in and look at this aerial view that the governor's office provided, that shows a pretty widespread view. So in all, 30 stream gauges in Nebraska reached all-time record levels. If you get into this map on your own, it's interactive, so it'll pull up the gauge records for whichever one you click on. I'll highlight a few today. The Missouri River at Plattsmouth, which is shown in this graph, recorded a crest of 40.62 feet, which is nearly 4 feet over the previous record that was set in 2011. And for those of you unfamiliar, 2011 was a historic flood on the Missouri River. We had not seen anything of that magnitude in a very long time, if ever, and we did not think that we would be seeing one here just a few short years later. The Niobrara River crested at 6.8 feet above the previous record stage near Verdell. However, you can see on this hydrograph that the gauge was lost. So we don't actually know what the true crest was. We know it was at least 6.8 feet, but since the gauge record was not continued, we don't actually know how bad that was. There were 41 breaches to federal and non-federal levees reported by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The damage was extensive and in many cases had significant impacts on the communities that were flooded in the area. Camp Ashland National Guard Base was inundated with floodwaters after an upstream levee breached. In fact, their campus was flooded to the extent that 51 of its 62 buildings had water damage. Those 41 breaches resulted in nearly 350 miles of levee damage. of levees that were damaged during the flood. And most of those were along the Platte and Missouri rivers. As you can see on this map, show where there were damages reported. And these are just a few images of those breaches in several locations. Flood conditions resulted in power outages in and around well fields that supply water for the city of Lincoln, which is our second largest city. So Lincoln gets all of its water from the Platte River just outside of Ashland, and they had a well field that was located, they had 3 wells that were located in a sandbar of the river. And once those wells started to flood, they lost water production capacity, which triggered water use restrictions to be enforced for the city of Lincoln. The National Guard dropped sandbags. That's what this image is, the sandbags that were used to stabilize the banks of the Platte River to try and protect the well fields from further flooding. On March 18th, the city issued a disaster declaration seeking assistance from the state, and they were covered by that March 12th declaration already, but they needed to request the state funding to help restore water production. And shortly after issuing the disaster declaration allowing for state funding, Governor Ricketts requested federal assistance, and due to the magnitude of flooding, an expedited federal declaration was quickly approved. However, Lincoln was still under mandatory water restrictions. This video actually shows the sandbagging effort if you get in. The video above shows when the power was lost from scouring. Residents and businesses had already responded to the call for conservation, saving a daily average of 1 million gallons of water. Visual evidence left behind by the high floodwaters was recorded in a collaborative effort by several agencies. So DNR knew right away that we needed to get some of our survey crews out when it was safe to do so, to collect high watermark information so that we could use that to inform the mapping work that we do through our CTP grant. We were mapping in a significant portion of the area that was impacted, but on top of that, high watermark information is hard to come by. It's so easily lost right after an event. So we tried to be very proactive and determine the locations we wanted to get out to right away. Within the first week, we're coordinating with the Corps of Engineers to have them help with some of this effort. They created a map. We pulled in some local communities, natural resources districts. The Lower Loop NRD went out and marked over 50 locations for us. And then we went to FEMA and actually were able to get a mission assignment approved that was then assigned to the USGS. So the group of us working together were able to collect data for more than 700 high water marks in 97 target locations. And it was a joint effort between DNR, USGS, the Corps of Engineers, NRCS, FEMA, Lower Loop NRD, and several local communities that marked their own high water. This is an interactive map. Since USGS completed the mission assignment, the data is available for download on the flood event viewer if anyone is in need of that. But you can see the impact to homes, all of the sand that was deposited in the areas around the Elkhorn and Platte River. We marked high water first, and then USGS went out and surveyed those locations after. DNR was also able to use that Sentinel imagery to create inundation boundaries for certain locations. We only had Sentinel imagery for the southern part of the event. The northern part had too much cloud cover, but this is the Platte River and the Elkhorn River, and you can see the inundation map that was created. We're hoping that communities will be able to use this to help them make informed decisions on where they should be developing, and helping some with recovery as that's still ongoing. And I mentioned that DNR, through our CTP program, CTP partnership, we were working in a lot of these areas on mapping projects. And one of those areas was the city of Seward. And we had Sentinel imagery from March 16th. And then we had issued preliminary maps before the event. So you can see the 0.2%, the 1%, and the floodway for the city of Seward. You can see that the boundary of the Sentinel-2 imagery from the actual flood event matches pretty closely to that 1% boundary. When we calculated out what had occurred in Seward, it was around a 3% event. So even though it wasn't as severe of an event, as the 1%, the boundary itself lined up, and we were proud of that. The depths maybe were a little different, but the boundary itself shows the area that is prone to flooding. And that Sentinel-2 imagery came on March 16th, but the crest of the Big Blue River was on March 14th. So it was a couple days later, and the Big Blue River crested at 22.98 feet for that 3% event. And Seward, like many other communities, they were tasked with sandbagging their highway to try and keep floodwaters from inundating town. Humans weren't the only ones affected by flooding. Pets and livestock became stranded without food or shelter. Impacts to our agricultural community were extreme. As floodwaters receded, pasture land and fields next to rivers and creeks were covered in inches or in sometimes feet of sand and silt and those giant ice chunks. The flooding occurred in the middle of calving season, so hundreds of calves perished, and there were reports of livestock carcasses floating away. Good reminder not to swim in floodwater. In some locations, cattle were isolated on islands and had no way to get to food. Many family pets were also rescued and later returned to their homes. There were stories of people who didn't want to evacuate without their pets, so agencies came up with ways to try and keep families with their pets and get everybody to safety. Hay bales were delivered to those in desperate need of supplies. After historic flooding in Nebraska, livestock was scattered and in danger of starving after being stranded without food. The National Guard units from Nebraska and Minnesota stepped in to help with Operation Prairie Hay Drop to keep cattle sustained during that critical calving season. Local farmers and ranchers also pitched in to help out their neighbors. Truckloads of hay were brought into Nebraska from within the state, but also from as far away as Ohio. We had one convoy of trucks deliver 200 tons of hay from North Dakota, and grain was also donated from farms in Ohio. So we definitely felt an outpouring of support from neighboring states. Governor Ricketts met with agency leaders and assessed the damage to help in relief efforts. He met with key officials to oversee the flood relief operations in the state. He traveled to flood-stricken areas to assess the damage from the historic flooding, and then also went to community shelters where flood victims had flocked to receive food and water. In total, 104 cities, 81 counties, and 5 tribal nations in Nebraska received state or federal disaster declarations due to the flood event. Most of those were due to flooding. Some of the counties were declared due to the winter storm, most of those out west, these counties. But Nebraska only has 93 counties, so having 81 of 93 counties declared at the same time is pretty monumental. Again, on March 12th, the governor had issued that preemptive disaster declaration. In the wake of subsequent flooding, most notably from July 8th to 10th in central Nebraska, we extended the initial federal disaster declaration through July 14th. However, Nebraska endured even more flooding after then, so an additional declaration was made. The Nebraska Emergency Management Agency coordinated with other state agencies to assist in flood recovery and follow up on reports of damage filed by local emergency managers. I'm sure you can imagine that is still ongoing. To finish up, though, we had the Sentinel-2 imagery, so I'm going to go ahead and show you some examples of what it looked like. This is near Valley. This is the Platte River. This is the Elkhorn River, and this would be kind of what it would look like on a normal day. And this is what it looked like in March of 2019. This is north of Omaha on I-29, the Missouri River, normal conditions in March of 2019. Flooding near Peru, which is in southeastern Nebraska. Again, this is on the Missouri River. So normal conditions in March of 2019. And these people had, had a major flood event in 2011, so had barely recovered from recent flooding before they were hit again. This is Rulo, the very southeast corner of the state. and south of Omaha along I-29, the Missouri River again. And Brownville in the southeastern corner along the Missouri River again. And that's all I have today. If anyone has any questions or would like the link to how to access the story map, feel free to reach out. And other than that, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Jamie. That was a great presentation. So the first one is there anything that your agency would have done differently?
2013, 2011, we had some lead time into those flood events. 2015, there wasn't a lot of substantial damage. So we didn't really have a packet put together. One thing that we've worked on since the event, we had to really put together our packet to help the floodplain administrators kind of on the fly. So we worked really hard to put together a packet so that we're ready in the future. On the data collection side, though, we had the mission assignment to collect high water marks. Since the event, we've been able to team with Silver Jackets to actually do training for DNR, some of the natural resources district in our state, local communities if they were interested, so that we have people that are ready to go out and start marking high water. And then the mission assignment in the future would just be for collecting survey. We found that the mission assignment for actually going out and marking high water was really difficult, and it took about 2 months to get people in the field. So the areas that we had gotten out to and were able to mark right away, we were good, but we lost a lot of that data or the high quality data before we could get out there. And the mission assignment for high water marks was pretty difficult to get. We were able to get LIDAR collection with that as well, since I had mentioned during the presentation that we were mapping in some of this area. The Elkhorn River in particular moves a lot, being a sand bed channel. And we knew that we couldn't map on the LIDAR that we had because we would have maps that would have floodplain not even covering the channel. So we were really happy with that effort, and it was a huge win for our agency.
Agreed. It was a win for our agency, Jamie. Thank you so much today.
Yeah,
I'm going to introduce the next presentation. It is the May 2019 Arkansas River Flood and Emergency Operations Center Perspective. The presenter is Brandon Claborn with Meshek and Associates out of Tulsa, out of the city of Tulsa. All right, you can start.
Hi, I'm Brandon Claborn with Meshek and Associates in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And today I have with me Michael Couch, who's our GIS manager at Meshek and Associates, David Williams, who is with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the Tulsa District Office, and Brooke Cavanis, who serves as the lead stormwater engineer for the city of Tulsa. 2019, the Arkansas River had a major flood event through the Tulsa area and areas up and downstream. Today, we'd like to share with you some of our experiences working together in the Emergency Operations Center during that event. For those of you not familiar with Northeast Oklahoma, the Arkansas River is the major river system that comes through this area and drains right through the city of Tulsa. About 10, 12 miles upstream of Tulsa is the Keystone Lake Reservoir, and both the Cimarron and Arkansas rivers, which drain from Colorado and New Mexico through Kansas and western Oklahoma, all the way down to the Keystone Reservoir. The other two major river systems you're going to hear us mention are the Verdigris and the Neosho, as shown on this slide. And they all come together down around the town of Muskogee that experienced major flooding during this event. And then, of course, the Arkansas River continues through the state of Arkansas, which also experienced significant flooding. Today, we're going to walk through this in a timeline format as we experience these events as they happened.
As a city built along the Arkansas River, City of Tulsa is no stranger to flooding. Our flood of record occurred in 1986 when we had 307,000 cubic feet per second of water in the river. We had major devastation for both residential and commercial properties.
So this storm event really started in early April. This is a time lapse of radar images showing cumulative precipitation, and you can see that during this time period, this area received some areas received over 10 to 15 inches of rainfall, and that started to fill our reservoirs rather quickly. even in this early stage of the flood, before it became a big concern in Tulsa and on the Arkansas River, the National Weather Service was already issuing flood warnings in several areas in northeast Oklahoma. So we were all kind of put on notice to be aware that this is a dangerous time and we need to pay attention.
Keystone Dam does drain around 25,000 square miles of watershed in Kansas and Oklahoma. Prior to its construction in 1965, floods along the Arkansas through Tulsa were common. However, since the construction of the dam, it has provided a tremendous amount of flood mitigation downstream. So floods are not uncommon when it comes to Keystone, and there are releases that are also not uncommon. However, releases typically are within channel downstream. And in the early part of May, the releases were being made such that there was no downstream damage occurring. And by May the 9th, the releases had increased to 70,000 cubic feet per second.
At that time, we have a national park in the city of Tulsa that was constructed recently by private donors with a cost of about $250 million. It runs right along the Arkansas River, and there is a reinforced concrete pipe that comes out of the pond that you see there on the right that connects directly to the river. When we installed this pipe, we installed both a sluice gate and a flat gate for double protection. When we were at 86,000 CFS, the park actually asked us to come out and go ahead and close that sluice gate. So we did that, and our city crews began pumping, bypass pumping water, any interior drainage out into the river.
Releases during the early part of May actually increased to 100,000 cubic feet per second. The downstream channel capacity is around 120,000 CFS. So again, these were not damaging releases. At the time, there was a lot of media interest because these larger releases are rather uncommon. And there was concern, but really it was more of a curiosity. Also at the time, the position of the Tulsa district was that this was not an emergency situation. This was a normal flood operation, which it remained through the first part of May.
With the flows reaching 100,000, that's when the city of Tulsa began looking at our systems. We have a levee system that runs along the banks of the river. The levee system was constructed in 1945. It was actually pre-Keystone Dam. We have pumps along this levee system to pump out the interior drainage. So we had our crews go out and make sure all the pumps were functioning. This is another structure that's close to the gathering place. We constructed this along with the gathering place. It drains the entire area behind the gathering and a little bit south. The area shown in green on the map actually flooded pretty severely in 1986. Most of these homes were underwater. Since then, actually since we became a FEMA community, all homes in this area had to be elevated, but the pre-firm structures would have flooded if not for the sluice gate on this structure. We tied all of the interior drainage, all of those local that used to go straight to the river pipes into this box structure that we can close off. And we have 2 pump wells for bypass pumping to protect this area.
And as these releases, began to increase, there was some growing concern in checking the plans and checking the possible scenarios, particularly behind those levees, because they are, as Brooke mentioned, rather mature at this point. And so Meshek at this point was tasked with going in and doing some updated studies, looking at scenarios for saturation rains behind the levees, or even a potential levee breach, what would occur in those cases. And we did encounter a bit of a public information security issue at this point, because we made these maps and put them actually onto a website for review by city staff. And at some point that website got leaked out to some other people. And there was a near miss where an official nearly announced an evacuation of several thousand people based off of the conception that this was a predictive forecast and not a long series of statistical scenarios. But thankfully, that was quickly overcome.
Yeah, so the area Michael was describing is protected by a levee. That everything that you see on the north side of the river in this particular image was protected by a levee. And the previous maps we made for the city showed what would happen in that area in flooding if we had a levee failure. The folks who were reporting on those maps, unfortunately, didn't have that context and said, hey, when we go to this higher release rate, these people are all going to flood. We got to get them out of there now. And it was a very dangerous situation. And we learned really quick in the Emergency Operations Center to be very careful at how we shared information because it can and will be used against you. The city then asked us, based on that, well, if we can, at 90,000 CFS, it's not a big concern. Water wouldn't back up and really impact any structures. But what happens if we go up to what was being considered at the time was 205,000 CFS? Now, if that levee system fails, we have major problems. And so with this information, since we had high detail LiDAR data, we were able to calculate depth grids and do some studies so that the city could be very active in their planning from an emergency operations perspective into how many people they were going to have to evacuate, where they were going to have to close roads, how they could get access, et cetera. And it quickly realized within the Emergency Operations Center that this type of data was extremely valuable. Now, the city also started to share this information with the public. We built a GIS-based web map that you see on the lower right-hand portion of the screen. And during this particular time, on May 18th, we were releasing 160,000 CFS was the flow through the Arkansas River. And down south of Tulsa in the Broken Arrow area, downstream, there's a large sports complex that the news media happened to be flying over, and we grabbed a photo, and then the bottom picture shows what our prediction of what the water coverage would look like, and the top photo shows what actually happened. And so we did a pretty good job predicting in this area.
On May 19th, a system balancing activity was in progress. And what that means is Keystone is operated as one of many reservoirs in the Arkansas River watershed in Kansas and Oklahoma. And they're all operated so that flood control is drawn down equally to a downstream control point at Van Buren, Arkansas. And the purpose of a flood control reservoir is to mitigate downstream flooding. So these reservoirs are being operated so that there's no downstream flooding along the river. In fact, by the 19th, the releases at Keystone had been reduced to 45,000 cubic feet per second, but the worst was still to come.
So that's when the next round of rain hit. This is some data provided to us from our partners at the National Weather Service. Nicole McGavick helped us put this information together. And as you can see, the storms just started to train right along an area upstream, if you will, of Keystone Reservoir. When we look at the totals from this particular event, just upstream of the reservoir in the area that you see in the pink and purple, those areas experienced 6 to 8 inches of rainfall. Furthermore, as you go up into Kansas and areas that drain south into Tulsa, so did those areas as well. So you had a widespread area getting large amounts of rainfall. And the National Weather Service was part of the team in the Emergency Operations Center. And in addition to the flooding that we were dealing with, they had several warnings to send out. We even had 12 tornadoes come through the area during this particular flood event, just during that May 20 to 21st timeline.
What had been a routine flood quickly became a flood emergency. This was becoming a historic flood with all of the rainfall that fell above not only Keystone, but the other reservoirs in northeastern Oklahoma. The flood storage was quickly becoming exhausted in Keystone, and releases were increased to 165,000 cubic feet per second. This was the largest release since 1986, and the releases would continue to increase from here. By May 22nd, inflow into the reservoir had jumped to over 300,000 cubic feet per second, and the flood control storage across the whole system had increased to 84%. This was a very rapid increase from one day to the next. Keystone was nearly full. The releases were increased to 205,000 cubic feet per second, and there were residential damages above Tulsa at this point.
And as you see, these flows were changing really by the hour, really too quickly for us to really make updated maps to get out to officials or the public. And so at this point on the 22nd, the mayor of Tulsa decided to essentially use some previously prepared maps of what the 1986 flood impact was and use that as their planning guide. Prepare for the worst, hope for the best. And here you see a picture of the actual briefing occurring, looking at that map. It was a high pressure situation. At one point I was making some updated maps and I got a call saying, hey, we're at the EOC. Can you print a map for the governor? He's going to be here in a few minutes. I had about a 5-minute warning to find the map, print it, and get downtown to the Emergency Operations Center. And basically that map that we had put out there, the mayor wanted that to get in the hands of the citizens, very literally, make it work on a cell phone. And so in a few minutes, we were actually able to take an existing website we had set up and make it be mobile friendly with this 1986 flood map. You didn't have to fiddle with any widgets or toggles. You just went to the address and it was there. You put in your GPS location, you had what you needed. And the mayor loved it. And it was really great. And in coming like 12 hours later, we had it updated with the most current model-based mapping. But this was that very fast-moving snapshot in time.
And once again, another round of rainfall hit this area. As you can see by the radar loops on the right-hand side, some of this heavy rainfall went right over Tulsa and right over the area in question. This didn't impact Keystone Dam as much as it did the other reservoirs in the system. At this time, you see a cumulative rainfall total on the right. That's a 4-day rainfall total, so it'd be the last 2 rainfall events that happens, but you can see over 10 inches fell in many parts of northeast Oklahoma. If you look on the graphic to the west, you'll see that the National Weather Service, the River Forecast Center and the National Weather Service was busy making forecasts, and much of northeast Oklahoma and southern Kansas was having moderate and major flooding at this time. Another example of the data Michael talked about was the ability to look at the depth grids that we sent out, that the city was able to send those out and tweet those out, and we saw really high levels of traffic using those websites. This is an area along Riverside Drive, which not coincidentally is right adjacent to the Arkansas River, that we had showed that the water would be underwater by the road would be underwater by a couple of feet. And sure enough, the aerial image on the left of the exact same area shows that that was a great predictor of what happened, and people quickly became reliant upon this type of data and developed a high level of trust. Unfortunately, you don't always get that level of results from your modeling. The model in this area, about 15 miles downstream, shows that we anticipated this parking lot that you see in the foreground being over 4 feet underwater. And in fact, it was high and dry. So there's always the good side of being able to communicate like this to the public, and there's always the bad side, is when your projections don't work out. Another area and another lesson we learned really quick was that in a modeling scenario, you always have to be careful of what elevation you map. This is an area that's overbanked. The water is flowing from left to right, top left to bottom right in this screen. Do you map the elevations of the adjacent to the river for these 2 brand new subdivisions that are under development? Or do you map the backwater elevation from the next tributary downstream? Is that how water gets there? So sometimes you have to do manual corrections. It's not as simple as pushing a button and making a map. In this particular area, even though we had 2017 LIDAR data that was less than 2 years old, it did not include these developments. We had to reach out to the developer's engineer, get their DTM files, and update our surface so that we could prepare maps, because the mayor said we are not going to send maps out that aren't accurate. Well, it's kind of hard to always stay accurate with the changing landscape that's out there. And when in a politically sensitive areas, these things become very important. So it's not always just about what we can do, but about what can be accepted politically as well.
By May the 23rd, peak inflow was recorded at Keystone, and that peak inflow was 322,000 cubic feet per second. And this wasn't a short duration flood. Inflow into the reservoir exceeded 200,000 cubic feet per second for 11 consecutive days. The reservoir at this point was completely full. That's why there were large releases occurring. In fact, by May the 23rd, the release was increased to 250,000 cubic feet per second.
And once again, starting to sound like a broken record, but another rainfall event moved through the area during a major flood event. And you can see on the radar loop just how bad it was. Another several inches, this time more focused on the Cimarron River and areas in western Oklahoma, but still draining into Keystone Reservoir and making our situation even worse. I do remember vividly this night being in the Emergency Operations Center, watching the tornado, or being issued a tornado warning. Luckily, we had a National Weather Service meteorologist with us at that time, because those tornadoes were then headed towards some of our houses where our families were while we were spending our time in the Emergency Operations Center. Just another one of those things that you have to consider whenever you're doing this type of work. Again, you can look at some of the totals for the storm event, and we're in the 13 to 15 inches of 10-day rainfall these last three events. And once again, the colors are almost all red and purple in the areas in northeast Oklahoma and southern Kansas.
If you look at some of the headlines in the local media, this just captures what a significant event this was for not only Tulsa, but the entire region. If you can see on a couple of these screenshots of the headline of the Tulsa World, you can see Keystone Dam, and you can also see the River Spirit Casino along Riverside Drive in South Tulsa and the inundation that was occurring at that location. On May the 28th, Keystone set a new record pool of 757.18. And what that means is it was a lot of water. It actually exceeded the capacity, and a deviation was in place to exceed the flood control capacity of the reservoir in order to avoid having to make a larger release. Any larger release at this point would likely have been a new flood of record in the city of Tulsa. As it was, the release was 275,000 cubic feet per second.
With the releases of 275,000 CFS, our levee system was about 60% inundated. Our levee commissioner actually called in the National Guard to come out and do 24/7 monitoring of the levees. They were concerned with the age of the levees, so they were out watching for things like sand boils, which is from water seeping under the levees and coming out the backside. When those would occur, they would place sandbags around them to contain them to that location. They were looking for erosion along the riverside of the levee, instability, and any areas that there could be overtopping.
The forecast had more rain in it, and sure enough, it delivered. Fortunately for us, if you watch this one track, it tracks just to the east of most of the areas where flooding would occur. This brings into another issue of worrying about when you have these high levels of releases, then you have local flooding events downstream. You start to have peak-on-peak flows, and you have even worse flooding. But for Tulsa in particular, as David was describing, we really dodged a bullet with this last storm event.
Once we got to May the 29th and the rainfall during that day fell downstream, there was a major change in the weather pattern. The system was nearly completely full. Keystone was full and into and beyond surcharge. Caw was full. All these reservoirs were full. But once we got past May the 29th, the damaging releases were quickly stepped down, and a long drawn-out drawdown of the flood pools in all of these reservoirs began.
To kind of wrap up this event from a rainfall perspective, the large area that you see in there in pink is 10 to 15 inches of rainfall, with small areas of 15 to 20 during this storm event. The stars, the colored stars that you see indicate where the major reservoirs are that we've been referencing. It was just really a rainfall event like we had never seen over a long period of time. They just continued to make things worse and worse. In addition to that, there were 48 tornadoes in the area. It just became a rather big event. The National Weather Service analysis of the rainfall showed that some areas were, in fact, in excess of a 1 in 1,000 annual exceedance probability. And you can see a rather large area between 1 in 50 and 1 in 100 flood event, confirming what we were observing with flows in the river systems.
So after the storm, the city of Tulsa had 0 residential structures that flooded. We were very fortunate because of City of Tulsa's higher standards. We utilize the FEMA floodplain and floodway, as well as the City of Tulsa floodplain. The City of Tulsa floodplain encompasses 40 acres of fully urbanized conditions for our floodplain. Any development is required to submit an engineering analysis that has no rise in the City of Tulsa floodplain or FEMA floodplain or floodway. FEMA declared a national emergency for the May 7th through June 9th timeframe. We had quite a few structures that were damaged, our drainage structures that were inundated the entire time during the event. We began doing damage assessments quickly after the waters went down, and these were all reported to FEMA, and then we began doing inspections with FEMA for reimbursements. What did we learn during this event? One of the key things that we learned is that preparedness was a major impact. The fact that we had maps already, we had all of our maps along the river so that we could show where the water was going to be, that Meshek has been preparing for us for years, was very helpful. We also have been doing condition assessments on all of our structures throughout the City of Tulsa. We were able to use these pre-existing videos and pictures whenever we submitted our claims to FEMA that showed the pre-flood condition versus the post-flood damage. The higher standards in the City of Tulsa, which prevented the residential structures from taking on any water. A lot of the homes that flooded in 1986, they were all safe during this event. So those residents were very thankful for that. A big thing too, when you're in the EOC, be sure and document daily what you're doing. We tried to go back on our timeline, and our memories were already starting to fade quickly after this. As many hours as you're spending in the EOC, days start to run together. So document every day.